In 1945, the Cold War officially starts. It is traced as starting with the Yalta Conference in 1945. The Yalta Conference is between Roosevelt, Stalin and Churchill about basically the future of liberated Europe. It's about also German demilitarization and the splitting up into zones. Polish territory, Russia gets territory up to the Curzon Line, Poland gets territory up to the Oder-Neisse Line. There's also about joining the war against Japan, starting joining the war against Japan, the United Nations, and free elections in Eastern Europe, which is also quite important. Over the course of 1945, the Soviets move into Eastern Europe, systematically destroying non-communist opposition using the Red Army and the NKVD, allowing communist parties to come to power in most of Eastern European states. Potsdam Conference is mainly about partly German demilitarization and the punishing of Nazis, as well as zones and reparations. As we move into 1946 and 1947, the relations between the powers break down, not only because there's new leaders, Truman replaces Roosevelt, who dies, and Attlee replaces Churchill, but also due to things like Kennan's Long Telegram, which is about basically Soviet containment, but also the Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech. As we move into 1947, the US begins the Truman Doctrine, which gives 400 million aid to Greece and Turkey to fight communists. Then we move on to the Marshall Plan in 1948, which is a way in which is stopping Eastern Europe turning communist, especially as communist parties do quite well in the elections. The Marshall Plan is also about giving America a market for goods as well. The Marshall Plan is quite successful. In 1948, it is moved to West Germany, and in particular is implemented in West Berlin, and therefore there's a new currency established called the Deutschmark. The Soviets bring in the Ostmark, and therefore leads to the Berlin blockade, which is a huge failure for Stalin because the Western Allies keep supplying Berlin by air with aid, which is incredibly successful. Also in 1945, the USSR gained the first atom bomb, or gained their atom bomb. China becomes communist under Mao Zedong, who beats Chiang Kai-shek, and the idea of the NATO is formed. As a result of the USSR gaining the atomic bomb, Kim Il-sung eventually goes to Stalin and Mao for support invading South Korea, which he does in 1950. Eventually, Douglas MacArthur leads a counterattack of the North Koreans have reached Busan, and this counterattack stems the tide of the war, and the war changes from about saving South Korea to rolling back communism and unifying Korea in a non-communist government, which works up until about the end of 1950, where the Chinese army, the People Volunteer Army from Mao Zedong, get involved and they help the North Koreans. Eventually it stabilises in around 1951 after Douglas MacArthur is sacked and Matthew Ridgway comes to power, and then in 1953 there is an armistice. Mao comes to power after beating Chiang Kai-shek in the Chinese Civil War. Then we move on to other struggles in places like Indochina, which leads to the formation of the Domino Principle, according to Eisenhower. Eisenhower becomes president in 1952 and immediately announces a whole new things. For example, a technologically advanced army over a large army, which is cheaper to maintain under the budget, and this is the idea of the New Look policy. Dulles, his foreign secretary, Dulles is quite important because he introduces things like rollback containment, not rollback and containment, they're already pre-existing policies, but things like brinkmanship and massive retaliation, which are huge policies that he comes up with. He also negotiated a series of treaties like SATO and the Baghdad Pact, which are hugely relevant. But also Dulles is quite important for using US policy under things like NSC 162/2 in order to increase the US Army and make sure the Army is at the state where it can fight the Soviets in Europe, because they still believe Europe will be the centre point of conflict. However, due to the fact that Khrushchev comes to power in 1953 after Stalin dies, there is a thaw in relations between the big powers, in particular seen by the Geneva Summit and the Camp David visit. This is in particular shown through the actions of both Eisenhower and Khrushchev, for example, in the Suez Crisis stopping Britain, but also Khrushchev begins his policy of de-Stalinisation in 1956 after denouncing Stalin at the 20th Party Congress. In particular, in Poland, there is the riots in Poznan. Eventually, Gonka comes to power. There's the problems in Hungary. Nash comes in, withdraws Hungary from the Warsaw Pact. Soviet troops run in on the 4th of November and destroy Nash, basically. There's also riots in East Germany in 1953, which solidifies the position of Walter Ulbricht. And as a result of 300,000 people fleeing to the west in 1953 and increasing numbers all the way up to about 1961, Ulbricht convinces Khrushchev in order to seal the wall permanently, which is hugely important. As a result, the Berlin Wall is formed. Kennedy reaches an understanding it's actually quite good for the US because it means there's a slight new chance of nuclear war. Then there's the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1961, which is quite in 1962, which is quite important. As Soviets put missiles on Cuba, there's a whole series of negotiations, including 2 telegrams. Kennedy responds to one in exchange for the missiles being removed. He promises not to invade Cuba and also to remove the missiles from Turkey. This also leads to the hotline being set up and also the nuclear test ban treaty. There's also the problems of Vietnam. Since 1954, at the beginning of the Dien Bien Phu, the French Foreign Legion is soundly defeated. Vietnam has been split between a non-communist government under Diem and also a communist government under Ho Chi Minh. In 1960, the National Liberation Front is formed, which aims to subvert the government of South Vietnam. As a result, Diem is also corrupt and nepotistic and eventually gets deposed by his own generals in 1963 under partly the guidance of the CIA, partly not. And this leads to increasing US involvement in Vietnam, which is a huge problem, as Diem was a very bad ruler. Thank you for listening.